Welcome back. In the second part of the lecture, we're going to move into the architectures of enslavement, resistance, and reconstruction. We'll start with the site pictured here. The architecture of enslavement is not always the way we picture it today, and learning with more precision how this horrific institution made its way across continents is important to thinking about political justice and equity in our current time. Located in Ghana, this infamous fort that we're looking at right now, the castle at Dix Cove, was long thought to hold hundreds of enslaved people bound for Brazil and the Americas within those very thick walls that we're looking at right now. In a groundbreaking study, Professor Lewis Nelson did the work, examined the blueprints, examined the plans and the histories of this site to uncover a very different use of the space inside, or at least most of it. So looking carefully at this plan, it's a horrifying sight, and yet it becomes clear that the enslaved people who were captured and detained here against their will were not brought here by the hundreds or even by the tens. Look carefully at the plan. Now that you've done so, the small space designated to hold the captured human beings in this space is labeled number 1 above. It could in fact hold less than 10 people at a time. Now this makes this space no less horrifying, as one enslaved person is way too many. There's no question here. But it tells us something about the insipid nature of slavery and how it functioned at first on a small and almost invisible scale for the outside eye, certainly not for the eyes inside who were losing their loved ones. It did this until it grew into a practice whose legacy that we as a nation are clearly still attempting to reconcile. What else can we learn from this plan? Looking carefully, what do those diagonal lines tell us about the site we're viewing? They let us know the thickness of the walls, right? These are massive, massive stone walls. They're protecting valuable people and things to be traded. It's also just a military fort that has a horrible connection. And as a military fort, the walls were thick, of course, to protect from attack. Also, we see in the very front that series of 4 square rectilinear spaces lined up that move from the front entry here on the left this way and this way. Those spaces are cargo holds. They're spaces for goods that would also be loaded onto the same ships as the enslaved humans held back in space 1 as designated on the plan. What does it mean that it wasn't hundreds of people loaded all at once? What does it tell us about our current situation? Send me an email with your thoughts. In the very same nation of Ghana, as places to enslave other humans were being constructed, places to protect communities from slavers were also planned and built. Here in the image, you see the modern remains of a strategy once used to protect communities from slavers who approached from the land. Creating homes and a life on the water, these groups could create bridges and then cut them as their attackers and as the enslavers approached. It's very seemingly simple, but this effective means of self-protection gave those under attack the advantage of height, of course. If you came up by boat, you were up and above, and anyone shooting arrows or otherwise would have the height advantage from inside those reed, wood, and thatched spaces. And you also, of course, had the advantage of being able to cut the bridges, pull them down, and make sure that no one could get to you except by boat or swimming, which is clearly a disadvantage for all types of predators, human and otherwise. Next, let's move across the Atlantic. We are now looking at the southern United States, and we're going to focus on one case study from the McLeod Plantation in South Carolina. Here we're going to look at the Gullah Geechee people, a fascinating self-assembling group made up of the enslaved who had come from many, many different parts of Africa. And while you're there, as weird as it sounds, be sure to visit the McLeod Plantation, and I'll tell you in just a minute why. But focusing back on this area, this low country, due to a shared climate and shared conditions for planting rice and indigo in West Africa, the Gullah Geechee people were known for their cultivation skills, and they taught most of the region, including the landowners, the plantation owners, and the enslavers, how to amplify yields and create ideal conditions for planting. The story of indigo is one such spectacular incident. So the traditional story about how indigo became, the fabric of the Americas, it's what dyes our genes, or at least it's what used to solely dye our genes. Now there's a chemical process involved, but that icon of American style, the traditional story goes that in 1740, a woman named Eliza Lucas, whose father was a colonel in the Southern Army, she was given seeds by her father for indigo on one of his trips to Africa. This source of the rich blue dye was highly prized. It wasn't to be found in the United States prior to this 1740 exchange. And Eliza Lucas is given the credit for really starting up the business of indigo dyeing in the United States as we know it. But the truth is, as I just mentioned, because of the people who she had enslaved, 20 people working on her plantation, because of their knowledge of how to process, grow, and dye with indigo, which they had learned in their respective countries in West Africa, they were able to teach her what to do with those seeds. They were able to teach her how to amplify their yields, how to strengthen the color, how to dye the fabrics. She's given the credit, and it is a story that people tell again and again because it is a woman making her way in a time when that was nearly impossible, and we do want to celebrate that, but it is even more important to know the source of that knowledge, the source of that agricultural heritage. So back to the McLeod Plantation site. It's one of two sites in all of the United States that tell the history of this architectural, landscaped, and agricultural region from the point of view of the enslaved people, or the ancestors of the enslaved people, in this case, at the McLeod site, the Gullah Geechee themselves. I had the opportunity to go last December. I was totally wigged out about visiting a plantation. It's not anything I've ever had an interest in. But I read before going to Charleston about this incredible site. And the pleasure of learning about it from one of the ancestors of the people who lived there, it didn't make the stories less difficult, but you could see the pride that the Gullah Geechee take in the work that they did, the way they are reclaiming their own history, the way they are proclaiming their own histories in these sites that have so long been clouded with only one side of the story. So let's think for a minute about the history of the architecture we're about to look into. In 1780, in the American War of Independence, the British General Sir Henry Clinton used this original home of the McLeods for his headquarters while planning the siege of Charleston. Many enslaved workers joined the British lines who were attacking the Americans in order to seek their own freedom, and the British Army evacuated them from their enslavers and from the city. After that, the plantation was occupied by Confederate forces during most of the Civil War, and the home, the so-called big house that we see here, served as a hospital. After the evacuation of Charleston in early 1865, the site was occupied by the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiments, made up of African American soldiers of the U.S. troops of color. So you can see this amazing layered history already. Later, the home was occupied as offices for the Freedmen's Bureau, and if you haven't heard of the Freedmen's Bureau before, Google it. It is a fantastic moment in U.S. history where, after the Civil War, the government came together in order to redistribute land to the formerly enslaved, to provide food, education, and opportunity for the thousands and thousands of people who had been in chains. The McLeod Plantation was a very important site for the Freedmen's Bureau. Freed people came to live on the site itself. Many of them set up temporary structures for housing, and some of the structures we're about to look at were reoccupied and used by the very people who had built them but had been enslaved by its owners. Unfortunately, in 1926, the McLeod family regained the property. And in the reversal from this monument to freedom, the owners renovated the house, changing what looked like a traditional farmhouse to intentionally give it a more classic so-called plantation or colonial style look. It's kind of revolting to think about. There's more information on this site from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. They have additional photographs, and they note the way that the McLeod Plantation has recently been named one of the African American historic places in South Carolina. So take a moment with the building. What do you see when you look at it? One of the first things that stands out, I hope, is this Greek temple style front porch. If we think about the Greco-Roman section that we studied, right? We are looking at a series of fluted columns. They meet a pediment. All of the elements of that classical temple style are there. And what else? Behind that, the house is a Georgian style house. We won't get into this, you won't be tested on it, but it has the makings of a Georgian style house. It's a converted farmhouse first and foremost, but in its symmetry and regularity, we have Georgian elements which sneaking in. And what about the land? This is a plan for the landscape at the Crowfield House. Built and occupied during a similar time as the McLeod Plantation. Take a look at what we're seeing in this landscaped plan. What's the treatment of nature? Is it wild and free and just as it was found? No, definitely not. We have not only the enslaved people of the region, we have the very trees, bushes, and plants surrounding the primary house here being put into order, being organized in a symmetry at times, in a manicured fashion, as if humanity, as if the owners of the house had control even over the plants and the way that they would grow. We see this sort of landscape plan around the world. It is a largely European inheritance, but it's important to think about even the way the bushes and flowers are shaped tells us something about the human desire to control, to show mastery over everything that we encounter. Now on to the saddlebag homes built by the Gullah Geechee. While these were originally cabins for people who were in bondage, people who were enslaved, many of these saddlebag homes were built using traditions that came directly from the different countries of West Africa that we identified. There's a rich history, rich architectural history there of the way that African building traditions have influenced the building traditions of the United States. So the saddlebag house, if you've ever seen an old Western where you have a horse that has literally two saddlebags, one on each side of its back or hips, that was the thinking behind the naming of this house. The house has often a central fireplace, as we see in that second elevation, and then the two rooms fall to each side of that central marker of the home. Sometimes each of those homes, let's look here in plan number 2. Elevation number 2 to the left, plan number 2 to the right. Often they had 2 doors. Sometimes, as in the upper plan, one family would live in one side and another family in another. Sometimes one large family occupied this small house. If you think about the room size, they're probably 10 feet by 10 feet on average. They change from site to site, but more than 16 people would live in these homes. What else are we seeing in these plans? We're seeing the variety of fireplaces, a central fireplace. In the top plan, we're seeing 2 symmetrical fireplaces. And in the bottom plan, this sort of modification of the saddlebag, or what's known as the dog trot, allowed wind and air to pass through this middle section, which would provide natural and engineered air conditioning of a sorts to the people inside. So many homes derive their own architectural plans from the saddlebag. As you start to think more carefully about it, you'll see it in more places than you imagined. For the final part of this second bit of today's lecture, I am thrilled to share with you the work of the artist Carol Walker. The project we're looking at on the left was an installation at a sugar factory in Brooklyn in 2014. It was the Domino Sugar Factory, in fact. Take a minute with this image on the left. What sort of architectural form are we looking at? What does it remind you of? What is it trying to recall? And then, of course, the main feature held within, but also just exceeding and pushing through those steel beams, is this incredible sculpture. Made in Sugar by Kara Walker. I posted a video that tells you more, shows you more of this project. It's a great demonstration of the way that contemporary art can push on some of the most pressing issues in our culture. Enjoy the video, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next class.